I got involved with international law as a law student at a time when I had in my own mind the idea that studying law I didn't want to end up the way my father did as a Wall Street lawyer. And so I had this idea of how do you experience law school without being uh, too vocationally driven. And it led me to international law and to the study of India's law, even to the study of Sanskrit as a language that you need to have some understanding of to grasp the originality of India's law. And then I was supposed to, when I graduated from Yale Law School, I was given a Fulbright fellowship to continue this work in Lucknow in India. But at the very last minute, the Indian government canceled the Fulbright program because India had failed to pay for some PL 480 wheat, and they were going to punish the country by denying them the privilege of hosting these Fulbright fellows. They did renew it the next year, but my father was ill, and I didn't never took advantage of it. But what happened was that a professor of international law at Ohio State got sick suddenly, and they were so desperate to find someone to take his place that they somehow located me, and I agreed to a one-year appointment. And almost from the day I arrived, I decided that an academic career was the place I wanted to be. I had never been a really good student until the last few years of undergraduate, college, and law school, so I never thought of myself as pursuing an academic career. But the idea of being the master of your fate at a young age, being able to work on what you were interested in, having most of your time scheduled according to your wishes, not anyone else's, and being part of a community interested in ideas and congenial in terms of values and perspectives, even in the conservative atmosphere of Columbus, Ohio, was very attractive to me. And I stayed there for 6 years, taught international law, and when the person who was sick and responsible for my original appointment recovered, he was so eager that I stay that he relinquished his seniority over the subject and more or less bequested it to me. And I then became gradually more involved in trying to understand controversial areas of international law. The first area that I worked in that was controversial was the U.S. response to Cuba's economic nationalism, which involved the expropriation of some, I believe, sugar factories and plantations, and a lawsuit that followed and went to the Supreme Court, or went through the American judicial system, raising this question of what does, to what extent self-determination has legal control over the natural resources of a country, and to what extent must it adhere to the foreign investment one-sided arrangement negotiated by prior governments. And I wrote on this case, Sabatino versus Cuba, I think. It's so long ago, I don't remember, but the name Sabatino was in the title, which became a very prominent U.S. Supreme Court decision in which my article was quoted and by the majority, which agreed with me that this was not a violation of international law, and it was one of the few progressive decisions that the court made in relation to third world issues. So I was very pleased with that investment of time, because I wrote several articles on this litigation. And that led me one day to the library at Ohio State, where I chanced upon an article by Fairbanks, Harvard China, I think he was China or Asian specialist, on the Vietnam War. And he raised what for me was kind of new perspective on the colonial nature of the American involvement. Fairbanks was the guy that, one of the people that got in trouble during the McCarthy era, was accused of being a communist sympathizer, I believe. But I'm speaking from pure memory of something that occurred, let's say, at least 65 years ago. I mean, my reading of this article, and that led me to write about the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and I had a rather prominent dialogue in the Yale Law Journal with John Norton Moore, who was a defender of the American role in Vietnam. We knew each other quite well and were quite friendly, and products of the so-called New Haven School of International Law. What really transformed me politically and later had the effect on my intellectual activity and academic work was invitations to visit North Vietnam during the war, which really gave me a much more existential perspective on what this kind of war really meant to the people of the country who were completely vulnerable. This was a peasant society that was being attacked by a high-tech superpower. It had leadership that was very impressive to me, having met earlier some communist leaders from Europe and thought of them all as kind of tedious bureaucrats. I was very impressed with these Vietnamese leaders who seemed like genuine national patriots and had a kind of cultural sensibility that was attractive to me, and had very little bitterness toward the United States. Ho Chi Minh had made schools in Vietnam teach the American Declaration of Independence throughout the war. And it was quite effective in the sense that it conveyed the message that the government didn't really represent the American people or the American vision of what kind of country it wanted to be. And then I became much more engaged with Vietnam. I had in this interim gone from Ohio State to Princeton, and that there was a chair at Princeton that had been empty for some years because they couldn't find anyone that could qualify for its unusual requirements, which was to be trained in law but not too interested in it. And they finally felt, I think, out of the frustration of not being able to find someone for some years, that I was close enough to that shared description that they'd take a chance with me. And I was the beneficiary of their not being able to fill the chair because it had accumulated a fair amount of money while it was vacant. So it allowed me to have research funds and the like. I should say a word or two about my own political background, because I was brought up by my father, a single parent, and he was extremely a loving person, but very much anti-communist, and in the sort of Cold War frame of mind. And he was the lawyer for some of the leading anti-communists, including the prime minister of Russia between Tsarism and Bolshevism, a man named Kerensky, who lived in New York. And I knew these people because of, and I'd been exposed to this. So my political maturity was much delayed, and it took me a long time to, in a sense, unravel my personal relationship with my father from my ideological differences. And a strong memory of mine is I did a very kind of trivial liberal thing at in my last year at Yale. I circulated a petition protesting the interferences of McCarthy with academic freedom. And I was astonished how few of my fellow students were prepared to sign such a petition, even though they agreed with its content and were friends or good acquaintances. Yale Law School at that time was classes were relatively small, 125 or so. And it sort of awakened me to this kind of dividing line between your career and your beliefs. And so many of my future colleagues, particularly at Princeton, gave priority to their career. And that meant that if they had beliefs that went against the status quo, they would confine their orbit to cocktail parties and private discussions. But if they were invited to be consultants to large corporations or the government, they would jump at that opportunity. And somehow that led me in the opposite direction, and I became convinced that to be a good academic in relation to students and intellectual life, one had to share one's commitment and engage outside the classroom in ways that reflected these beliefs. In other words, I thought of teaching and scholarship as a dimension of what I called engaged citizenship. And that part of the pedagogical challenge at a university is to make students feel comfortable in combining their career aspirations with their beliefs and not being too timid about engaging in various forms of activism. That a democracy really depends on its best educated people engaging actively and not being either co-opted by the system or intimidated by it. And that sort of, on one level, separated me from a lot of my colleagues, particularly at Princeton, but also created a kind of less localized community of people who shared this outlook, and that kind of community was formed by the long anti-Vietnam movement in the United States, and led me to people like Chomsky and Howard Zinn and others, Daniel Ellsberg, and we all became good friends in the process of that interaction, and felt closer than to most of our colleagues at universities where we were at. Yeah, it's hard for me to speak about the others because they were, all three of them had complicated and long encounters, probably more so than I did, particularly in these earlier years. And I think particularly Chomsky, because he spoke out on Israel-Palestine at an early stage. I came to that issue much later, and that's one of the that was one of the brightest red lines in academic life at that time in liberal institutions. And so I understood that and sort of avoided it for a long time because I thought it impaired it would be distracting and impair my effectiveness in relation to these other issues that I cared about and probably wouldn't have any bearing on Israel-Palestine, about which I really knew quite little, even though I had a nominally Jewish identity and background. But among other things, my family background was highly secular and, if anything, anti-religious, so that I had very little knowledge or experience of what it meant to be a Jew in America. But I was brought into this issue partly out of my friendship with Edward Said and Iqbal Ahmed that flourished toward the end of the Vietnam period, and it came by stages for me. And prior to that, I'd been in the 70s quite involved through students in part in trying to understand what was happening in Iran. And I had the insight that Iran was going to be the next testing ground of this American policy toward third world countries. So I didn't have my Vietnam experience, oddly enough, didn't result in much of a backlash, because by the time I was somewhat visible, mainly out of these trips to North Vietnam, which were reported in the New York Times, and in the case of the first one, on front page for a couple of days, more or less issued the framework of a peace agreement through me that was much more favorable than what Kissinger and Hu negotiated maybe 6 or 7 years later in Paris. And a lot of people, of course, as you know, died in that interval between 68 and 75. So but that was seen, there was enough of a division in America by that time that it didn't occasion. In fact, the U.S. government tried to debrief me, and they were sort of respectful of this initiative. There's a law, against so-called private diplomacy. I think it's a 19th century or maybe even the 18th century law, but they didn't try to invoke that, although I'd been warned before I went that it was a risky thing for me to do, and I was somewhat concerned about it, but nothing happened. But when I was involved with Iran, there was a lot of backlash. I was attacked in the New York Times, and Anthony Lewis, who was a prominent opinion writer at that time, wrote a whole column about a conversation he had with me when he came to Princeton, and I represented the wrong kind of intellectual from his point of view, and sided with the crazy mullahs instead of the rational Shah. The truth is, I was trying to understand the conflict rather than to take real sides. The New York Times also, when I came back, invited me to write an opinion piece, to which they gave a very inflammatory headline, Trusting Khomeini, which generated some death threats over the years toward me. But I'd gone on that trip with Ramsey Clark and Philip Luce, who was a sort of religious activist in the U.S. And we had the opportunity to meet the emergent leadership in Vietnam, and then had this long 3-hour meeting with Khomeini the last day he was in Paris before he returned to Iran. And he said many interesting things in the course of that meeting that, had the West responded in a more constructive way, might have led to a different history. It's hard to know, of course. But Brzezinski was then National Security Advisor, and he was very close to the Shah people, and he didn't want any kind of effort at accommodating this historic shift. And so the confrontation occurred right at the beginning, and Israel, of course, pushed it, and it may have been not that the Iranian Revolution didn't turn out in a pretty disappointing way, and one doesn't know whether that would have happened had it not been under such destabilizing pressures from outside, and including the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s, where Saddam Hussein was encouraged to attack Iran, and then, of course, was himself the victim of a regime-changing intervention 12 years later. I mean, the shocking treatment of Iraq and the Iraqi people is one of the darkest stories, I think, in American history. It's well known as some of these other issues, involving Palestinians or Vietnam, but it deserves to be well known. Well, it was somewhat distinct. I think I was invited by the Ford Foundation or some kind of to be part of a group, a sort of study group that went to the West Bank and tried to understand the politics of Israeli occupation. And that led me, as often in these issues, in this case, to collaborate with a scholar on the international law dimensions of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. And as I said before, my friendship with Edward Said led me to an invitation to go to Beirut at a time when the Palestinians were very present in Lebanon, and Arafat was their leader, and I had the opportunity to meet with him in a good informal setting. And one thing led to another. Through writing quite a bit and through the kind of more existential experiences going, and then at one point, Israel, I think, tried to make an effort to recruit me to more Zionist-friendly position, invited me to some kind of conference in the early 70s in a kibbutz where I went with people who were Americans who were sympathetic with Zionism, among them Michael Walzer, whose name you might know. And these various experiences, I went to the UN, then had a fact-finding mission, 2000, to Gaza after a military incursion there. And the main change came in 2008. I was appointed Special Rapporteur for Occupied Palestine over the objections of Israel and denied access to Israel to carry out the mission that were part of this position of the UN Human Rights Council. And so I went to Egypt and Lebanon and Jordan quite a bit during the 6 years that I was Special Rapporteur to try to make up for the fact that I was excluded from the West Bank and had to enter Gaza by way of Egypt, which was difficult for independent reasons. But finally I was able to do it in 2012 and had a interesting experience. So I was constantly being attacked as a self-hating Jew and as leading anti-Semite and all kinds of there's a LA organization, I think, called the Holocaust Museum or Holocaust Institute, that published a list of 10 leading anti-Semites in the world, and they listed me as third, which led me to believe I must be doing a good job in the UN. And the first two were, I think, Khomeini was first, and the Prime Minister of Turkey was second. So I was in at least prominent company, maybe not good company, but and I remember I was teaching at that time already at University of California, Santa Barbara, and my students somehow saw this list. It was publicized more in California, and I said, "How can you be? Why are you listed there?" And so it's rather difficult for me to explain the situation to them, but they were as astonished as I was. Confirmed the understanding that life, it was, of course, 2 or 3 years, it was several years after the so-called disengagement, which was in 2005, where Israel withdrew its troops from occupying Gaza to the border of Gaza and disbanded the several settlements that it had in Gaza, but it kept it under blockade, a comprehensive blockade with a very restricted dual-use list, so they couldn't import, for instance, pasta and very innocent-sounding items. And it had a kind of claustrophobic feeling, and periodic military incursions. They were unconditionally vulnerable to attack. And I had the opportunity to talk with several Hamas leaders, all of whom indicated a desire for a long-term ceasefire up to 50 years, and claimed, which I think was confirmed by some independent research, that they had tried to enlist Washington after the 2006 election, which were won by Hamas, in trying to avoid violence between Israel and Gaza. But the U.S. wasn't interested, Israel wasn't interested, because it seemed to want to keep Gaza as a combat zone where it could periodically test weapons and tactics and remind its Arab neighbors of what was in store for them if they provoked Israel. So the almost official line was to keep the people of Gaza on what they called a subsistence diet, that is, only allow enough food and medicine to keep them alive, but not to enable a decent life of dignity. And so what was once a fairly robust economy continuously has declined since then. Now there's extremely high unemployment and poverty and inflation rates. And in this period of heat, recently, no air conditioning was available because electricity was cut, and 90% of the water is polluted, and so it's a really abysmal place to find oneself confined as the 2 million people there. And Israel basically holds the people accountable because it was a free election and Hamas won the election and was able to prevail over the more corrupt Fatah alternative party that Abu Mazen runs in Ramallah, where the Palestinian Authority has its headquarters.
The conditions you describe make it seem as if it's a deliberate provocation to violence, as if testing how much repression and conditions of starvation virtually people will accept before they rise up in resistance. That seem plausible at all? Again, you say testing weapons.
Yeah, I think it's a definite impulse, and I think it's even one that the current Israeli government welcomes. I think they want to provoke in order to have the pretext for suppression or aggravated suppression. I think Israel is sophisticated in its tactics, so it engaged in sort of blackmailing Palestinians to serve as informers and collaborators in various kinds. So it was very hard for the Palestinians to shape a effective movement under these conditions. So it's not surprising that they retreated into these kind of militia formations like Islamic Jihad, and there are a couple of others, smaller ones, and have under very difficult conditions, including targeted assassinations and the like, maintained a position that partly uses violence as an instrument and partly nonviolent methods of resistance, like staging these demonstrations of right of return. 2/3 of Gaza are refugees from other parts of Israel and were part of the Exodus in 1948 and again in 1967. And they still cling to the idea that their home and homeland is now what is called Israel. When I first arrived at Princeton, I was attached to the Center of International Studies, which was headed by a man named Klaus Knorr, who was very much of a Cold War warrior and had close connections with the strategic thinkers at the Rand Corporation, and invited them to be visitors in his center. In the previous year, Herman Kahn had published On Thermonuclear War with the Princeton Press, and that was, in a sense, the most influential of the books that came out of this defense intellectual world, of which Dan Ellsberg, as you know, was part of before he broke with it by copying the papers. And as I've tried to make clear, he wouldn't have had access to the papers had he not been part of that world. And so there's kind of irony in his connection with it. But I was seen as a kind of hostile presence in relation to that from my first arrival there. And my impression was that it had strong CIA connections in the history department, and the dean of students was thought to be actively recruiting for the CIA. I mean, it was a time when the war, the Cold War, unlike World War II, was seen as a war of ideas as well as a confrontation that of a military political character. And CIA funded magazines and did a variety of things to try to influence public discourse, and especially at these elite universities, at Princeton, Yale, Harvard. They tried very hard to recruit faculty people to serve as consultants. They wanted to be sophisticated about the culture of countries they were dealing with and the history of the countries. That was, again, part of the Vietnam learning experience was that they didn't understand Vietnam as a country, and that they wanted to do better in those regards in the future. So there was this kind of active effort that created a certain kind of atmosphere within the university that was very much inconsistent with my view of an independent institution of learning that was not tied one way or the other to a political party or to the government.
Did you feel you ever came under attack by politicians who, and during that time, of course, and today, who really deem any kind of dissent as meaning you're the enemy? I mean, Dan Ellsberg did after he released the Pentagon Papers.
I think Ellsberg was, much more in the eye of the camera than I ever was, and my troubles were really local. I know that I was part of the early phases of cancel culture, that I was, invited to some TV and interview programs, and the producer at the last minute told me that they were told not to have me as a guest, and it happened with a congressional committee testimony also a couple times. But and you never know what might have been had you not had this kind of blacklisting experience, because most of it occurs in ways that don't become known. It's the invitation that's not issued, or the conference that's not held. Is much more than the canceling of a lecture that has been scheduled or is held, is in some way takes place.
A friend of mine, Bill Polk, who was involved with the State Department.
I knew him.
Did you know him?
Yes, quite well. In
Oh.
fact, he kept inviting me to his place in France.
You should have gone. I've been there a number of times.
Is that right? No, I wanted to go, but it just never logistically worked out. No, we were on friendly terms.
Well, one of my last visits there, he gave me a book, Thomas Schilling's. I forget the title. It's right over a couple feet away from me. But
Strategy
in it,
conflict?
it would be it, yes. In which Schilling advocates a diplomacy of violence, which we certainly saw on full display with Donald Trump's, threats to North Korea, but also more discreetly in our foreign policy in general, it seems to me.
Well, and when, in my Harvard interaction with Dan Ellsberg, he was very influenced by that book and by Schelling as a way of thinking about nuclear strategy.
So
he later regretted it, but it was part of the formation of his particular strategic vision. And he regarded Schelling as his most influential undergraduate faculty advisor.
Okay, that's interesting. Was Samuel Huntington there yet?
I'm not sure. I know that I never heard Dan mention him. I knew Huntington very well for a variety of reasons, but I don't think. Dan, was primarily at that stage particularly interested in economics, not in international relations or political science. So even if Huntington very well, just before, he was a classmate of Brzezinski, I believe, and I think it was just before. I'm not sure. Too long time ago. You have to forgive my memory lapses.
Well, there's nothing to forgive. We all have them. Maybe me worse than most people. Shall we stop here?
I can continue for another 15 minutes if you wish.
Well, then let me ask you to elaborate a little bit more, perhaps. I mentioned earlier about Fulbright, and it goes to the question of those politicians who would come to oppose the Vietnam War. So one was J. William Fulbright, who wrote quite critically of the Pentagon. Another book I just went back and revisited was one by Pete McCloskey, who was Republican, but anti-war, anti-Vietnam War representative. Anything to say about that element in that time, politicians who were moving to become opposed to Vietnam War and adopting what I'll call more positive policies?
Yes, I knew them both reasonably well, especially McCloskey, actually. He was younger. And part of my receipt of the Pentagon Papers was the result of McCloskey refusing to accept them. McCloskey and a senator named Vance Hartke took part in a Princeton teach-in which Ellsberg took part in, and had the Pentagon Papers with him. This was before their publication, before the New York Times. And so I received them as a default person, because neither of them wanted to take them. And I think that tells one quite a bit about this in a governmental setting. They didn't want to burn their bridges to the established order, even McCloskey, who was more outspoken than Hartke, I think. And so they were willing to give their opinions on the war, even in a teach-in context, but they were not willing to violate the law governing classified information, or the so-called espionage laws and so on. And I think that was characteristic of that time, that even McGovern was also sort of in that, and there was a senator from Iowa named Hughes, who was also anti-war, and they convened congressional discussions that I took part in. That's how I got to know them initially. And McGovern and McCarthy, the other McCarthy, and Hughes all ran for president, and I was part of their advisory group. That we didn't do very much, but we were listed as advisors.
That brings up the Espionage Act, which by contrast shows how courageous you, Dan Ellsberg, and some other people who actually handled the Pentagon Papers were in putting so much at risk, knowing that this draconian law is available, as Dan Ellsberg would eventually feel or have brought against him.
Dan was much more aware and conscious of this kind of risk that he was taking, and probably pushed to take by my former student Tony Russo. I'm not convinced that Dan would have acted on his own if he'd been alone at Rand in that sense. But they formed a kind of friendship and political bond, and that was very important. I don't deserve credit for courage in this context. It was more a matter of ignorance. I didn't really know much about the espionage laws, and I felt I was doing something quite innocent, and I didn't think of myself as subject to criminal liability until the FBI had visited me, and I received a subpoena from the federal grand jury in Boston. But prior to that, I just thought I was being an anti-war activist.
Well, I think, if I may, that goes to the point, though, of the Espionage Act. It's not about counterintelligence, although that's an element of it, but it's also about suppressing dissent. If you read it closely and realize that it's not, it's this, continues on the Sedition Act, which at one time was part of it. Now it's more discreetly part of it.
Yes, I think it functions as a kind of anti-treason law. I don't know this area very well, but I know it's used very harshly. The Assange case has now been dragging on for some years, and he's being victimized in ways that he shouldn't be. One of the outcomes of the Nuremberg trial of German war criminals was that individual citizens had an obligation to disclose the war crimes of their leaders. Franklin Roosevelt, early in the war, made an appeal to the German people to collect information about the war crimes of their leaders. And really what the Assange did, even to a greater extent in a way than Ellsberg, was to show the kinds of crimes that were being committed in especially Afghanistan by U.S. military personnel. And I think and that's what Chelsea Manning was prosecuted for also, you know. It's really a challenge to the viability of democracy in the 21st century, because since, as we earlier discussed, the media is not a check on governmental abuse and wrongdoing, and therefore one needs these more spontaneous checks, and if there is to be an allegation under the Espionage Act, the government should have a burden of proof to show that either the information disclosed was false or the activity was permissible under the laws of war, you know. But to say that it's a crime to disclose crime seems to me to be stretching the authority of the state beyond what it should be.
Well, as you know, and perhaps you might comment on it, beginning, you know, torture became something out in the open. I mean, classified and hidden as well as possible, but relative to previous times, out in the open, so to speak, because so many people knew about it. And if you bring a lawsuit against, and we had one time had the War Crimes Act that was intended to punish U.S. war criminals, that was nullified basically. And today, Nuremberg has been turned upside down. It's the war criminals who go free, and the people who reveal that they're the war criminals that are incarcerated.
Yeah. The Nuremberg vision was always deficient because it didn't look at the crimes of the victors, you know, as if they, and in that sense, it's like the veto power. If you win, you're not accountable. If you lose, you are accountable and you pay with your life.
Anything else you'd like to say? Well, you have the chance.
I don't know.
I'm sorry, trying to.
I do think this is a time of crisis for the future of democratic governance, and partly for the reasons you've been working on, the surge of influence and support relating to this fanatical anti-right ideological campaign that surfaced in the Trump candidacy and then presidency, and now is in a new phase, but probably more toxic than ever, and really does represent a threat that never existed, and certainly not in the McCarthy era, of an American version of fascism becoming the dominant ideology of the country. And like in Weimar Germany, the opposing forces are not nearly as vigorously mobilized or financed. And so it paints a dark picture of what the future beholds at a time when the national crises of this sort also disable the country from addressing these global challenges. Climate, there was a temperature of 81 degrees centigrade recorded in Iran a couple days ago. And with the comment that one should change the phrase from global warming to global boiling. But 81, I don't know what it is. It's in Fahrenheit, but it's about, must be about 140 or something, maybe even more. And for these Republicans last night, apparently were not, at least one of the prominent ones declared that climate change was a hoax. I think it was the businessman Ramaswamy, and none of them gave really encouraging responses.
And just so I didn't hear wrong, you didn't say anti-right campaign, but right-wing campaign. These right-wing campaigns we're talking about, correct?
Yes.
We could go on. I've got so many more things I'd love to talk to you about, but looking at the clock, shall we stop here?
Yeah, I think it's a good place to stop. If you think it's worth it, we can do a sequel.
I'd love to do that and follow up on some of the questions that this opens up. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, and look forward to talking to you some more.
Great. Keep up the good work you're doing.
Well, you too. I wish I had your energy.
I wish I had yours. We can trade.